On behalf of the Goethe-Institut and 1014, I would like to welcome you to Marking Absence's Shifting Narratives, our set of conversations on new monuments and the processes, narratives, and forms involved in creating them. Monuments have been at the forefront of public conversation for the past few years, and conversations about their roles in our communities seem particularly urgent right now. Monuments are sites of narrative, a story worth telling, a moment or person worth commemoration, but narratives aren't static. As our societies and cities change over time, conflicting ideas about monuments, some of which have always been there, bubble up to the surface. With these conversations, we are choosing to look ahead and focus on the process of making monuments, the present and the future, and where we choose to go. This is the last conversation in the series, a matter of public inspiration, and we're really going out with a bang. If you missed any of the previous 3 conversations, you can find the recordings on our Facebook and YouTube pages for 1014 and the Goethe-Institut New York. I would like to thank Niama, Safia, Sandy, who curated and organized this project. This project would not be possible without the help of the dedicated teams of 1014 and the Goethe-Institut, as well as all of the panelists. It's part of a bigger project called Shaping the Past, a partnership between the Goethe-Institut, Monument Lab, and BPB, the German Federal Agency for Civic Education. A big thanks to everyone for their support and cooperation, and finally, a thanks to you, our audience, for joining us here today. It's my pleasure to introduce Nyama Safia Sandy, our curator, who will introduce today's speakers and moderate today. Nyama is a New York-based curator, essayist, and musician whose practice delves into the human story through the critical lenses of healing, history, migration, music, race, and ritual. She is an agitator who calls into question and makes sense of the nature of modern life and celebrates our shared humanity in the process. Her aim is to leverage history, the visual, written, and performative arts, chiefly those of the global Black diaspora, to tell stories we know in ways we have not yet thought to tell them, and to lift us all into a higher state of historical, ontological, and spiritual wholeness. So I'll hand it off to Nyama. Thanks and welcome again, everyone.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you so much to our incredible guests, Jerald Cooper, Walter Cruz, Nyla Eopianga, Kaneza, Schaal, and Hank Willis Thomas. I'm just going to share just a bit about what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. This conversation is called A Matter of Public Inspiration. And we've invited, of course, a cross-section of brilliant thinkers leading the charge to bring social justice to their communities through creativity and thinking about architecture and design, each to reflect on the landscape of their cities. At their best, monuments and public art installations can become part of a city's psyche, part of a community's psyche, acting as extensions of ourselves, our hopes and dreams. Together, the panelists today will share the fixtures of their community, whether that be pieces of architecture, their favorite buildings, or we may have some wildcard answers, and thinking about how those things have shaped and inspired them and how those objects may function in their lives. So Gerald, because we're doing this in alpha order, you are up first. You're gonna have to unmute yourself, my dear. And let me just read your bio really quick.
Oh no.
You You don't want me to read it? I cannot read it. Let me know.
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Does that mean I should read it? Or does that mean...
Nah, don't worry about reading it.
Okay.
Cool. So what was the question? Tell me.
So what is a monument, a building? I know for those of you who don't know, Gerald has founded this incredible platform on Instagram called Hood Mid-Century Modern. So what is a building, a piece of architecture, a structure, anything really that you find that exists on the landscape in a city that I know you lived in many different places around the globe thus far. So is there a particular object or a group of objects that you feel just has become a part of your life and has inspired you? I think the conversation about monuments right now and public art in particular is often one framed negatively. And so I want to think about what actually inspires, what feeds our spirits, what feeds our souls. So I wanted to hear from each of you about that.
Yeah. Can y'all hear me good? Cool. So I think it's such a blessing right now. I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I just happen to be at Hank's show. And which is just like full of these monuments from the chain, the chains and the basketball sort of vibration. It's just like an amazing show, and it really is something that really touched me. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio. My family's from Georgia. And, during the Industrial Revolution, they came up, migrated up to Cincinnati. And it's been incredible to think about, monuments and, starting to account hood, mid-century, modern. So in connection, I just kept hearing everybody talk about gentrification. But I'm like, bro, we don't even know nothing about this neighborhood. You know what I mean? We don't know nothing about the biggest value proposition, which are the buildings. Which we have connections to, but we don't have any ownership generally of, whether it be like actual ownership or just like knowing what, their history or why they were built and for what purpose. But then I started to discover like the safe houses. The Ohio River is the most, is the super high, was the super highway of the Underground Railroad. African Americans had to really identify built structures very early, in a case of life and death. And so, these things have been going around in my mind over the last year, not too long as I've sort of come back to my spiritual home after living in LA and London and New York for the last 15 years. And so these monuments, going to the John Rankin House, which is essentially the Uncle Tom's Cabin, or looking at Zaha's building, in downtown, Cincinnati, which is our contemporary art center and her first North American building. And, some say one of the more important buildings, built in the 20th century because of, her background. They mean a lot, and they always meant so much to me. And I used to be mad. I used to be like, man, whose names are these on these buildings, and why, what's the relationship between them and these buildings? And, it was a really empowering moment that, when I learned what buildings were what and why. So you start to see this cultural narrative move through your city. Like, oh, those are Italianettes. Like, those are French. Like, those, you start to become full with understanding it. And then me learning about my heritage and built spaces, it's just been, unbelievable. And then a couple of years ago, I was able to start donating to Zaha, to the Contemporary Art Center, and put my father's name on the building. And starting to flip the narrative. So when I bring my niece to the building, she sort of already connects, at this higher power. And so it's been really empowering, to me, discovering parts of my legacy and parts of the legacy of my city, through these built spaces and these monuments that exist within them.
Awesome. So I didn't know if you wanted to point out a particular building at all, or apart from what you've already done.
I mean, the John Rankin House to me is the biggest monument of the Black utopia coming from the South. It was the sort of site of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the tale of, Toni Morrison speaks very clearly about, Cincinnati and our, Toni and Beecher Stowe speaks very much about like these places. So I think about the John Rankin House being that you would have been told when you started your journey to imagine this house, this thing that you were then going to, and then you would have like created this piece of art in your mind of what this house looks like, and then you literally you're literally going from slavery to freedom, with one river and this monument, which is now this house, which is now a monument in a museum. So that's one that's like really meant a lot to me, and I've been going up there to pray and to just really connect with. So I would say that's one that really sticks out to me. Oh, then he done pulled it up.
Of course I did.
Jeez. And it's like perched on the top of a hill, just very quintessential. You can see it from all different areas. And then right on the back of that house was just it was north, right? It was like you spend a couple of hours there. If you were injured or sick, you may spend a night or two. But you really just kept it moving north,
Do you know the significance of the stars on the side here?
I don't know the significance of the stars, but there's a lot of inside the house, you have a lot of relics and sort of vibes of the time. John Rankin was a Presbyterian pastor, and the home was sort of in this. I want to say it was like this traditional sort of like German sort of farmhouse or Dutch farmhouse. Of that time, and it literally is it's literally no other house around it. And during the 1800s, mid 1800s, during the highest passage of the Underground Railroad, there were these candles that were lit in the windows, and one candle meant something, two candles meant another. And for everybody who hasn't read or inquired about Uncle Tom's Cabin, I call it the popular culture thing that helped free slaves. People in the North hadn't had a beautiful they hadn't had a tale of slavery and the escape for freedom like this. Uncle Tom's Cabin was the first American bestseller.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
For sure.
So next up we have Walter Cruz. Do you also want me to not read your bio, Walter?
Yeah, you can skip it.
I can skip it?
Yeah.
Wow.
Before I get my answer, I just want to spread some love to Gerald. You probably have my favorite Instagram account. I love that account since the day I started following it.
Yo, that's wild. Thank you so much, man.
For sure. Yeah, I guess I've been trying to think about this answer for a little bit of time now. And I guess with the understanding of architecture being this idea of space and spatial experience, and right now in this pandemic that we're in, that we're being forced to be inside, I've been thinking a lot about lack thereof in public art space or architectural space. And I thought about 6-foot folding tables, mainly because those are the tables that vendors use outside. Here in New York, between the Bronx and Harlem, I frequent a lot. That takes up a lot of the public space. There's all these vendors that are outside, and the lack thereof. Like these days I walk around and there's not as many, or if any, outside doing their daily sales and just vending as much as possible. And to me, that is one of the biggest architectural features of Harlem and the Bronx is like, when they're not there, you notice how much empty space there is. And when they're there, it's like you almost want to be squeezing between people to get to those tables with the rings, or get that hat, or get that freshly painted t-shirt off the street. So it's made me create a different level of appreciation for them not being there as much as they usually are there. So shout out to those vending tables. That's the object that comes to mind.
Thank you, Walter. I so enjoy your person. Okay. Before I move on, did you want to say anything else? Or is that it?
Yeah, everyone should go follow Hood Mid-Century Architecture.
Word. Go follow Hood Mid-Century Architecture, everybody.
Appreciate you, Brett.
An air horn. I'm living. Okay. So next we have the brilliant Nyla Eopianga. Do you also want me to skip your bio?
Yes. Skip
okay.
I'll give a quick background about me. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this conversation. It means a lot to me. I'm originally from Gabon, Central African country where we speak French because the colonizers are French. I have lived in the US for 7 years now. I came here to study architecture, and I had not expected to study Blackness. I had not expected to study about myself, which is something that I never really considered being important, relevant, something I never really thought about being, having grown up in a country where most people look like me. And I think my journey to today was very interesting, as like I said, wanted to study architecture and discovered a lot more than that. So as we were thinking about buildings that perform and act and present themselves as a monument, I have actually two buildings that I like to talk about. I actually have a lot more because, you know, architecture, but for the sake of time, I will just go over two. And I am going to share my screen. So the first one, would be Crown Hall, which for all anyone who's been into architecture and who's of Bronzeville, the neighborhood in the south side of Chicago, it is a big reference. It's a big building. It's a landmark for Chicago, for architecture, for the world of modern architecture. I have a love and hate relationship with this building. When it comes to hate, I would say that I think it's a symbol of early gentrification. It is placed in the center of the former Black metropolis, but it is not catering to the Black people who live there. My first introduction to this building was when I was given a tour to the school before I went to there, Illinois Institute of Technology Architecture School. I was told about it being designed by Ms. Van der Rohe and how it was a staple building. And I walked around the campus, walked around the building, and I did not see any Black person. And then when I started going there, I remember my first year, we were only, 5 Black students among 400. And it was always very uncomfortable for me to be there. And it was always a reminder of how architecture as a practice in the Western world is not really catering to people who look like me. Then at the same time, the love part of it comes from the fact that it's in this building that I learned about architecture. I learned about space, and I learned about solving problems of space. And I learned about myself. It's in this building that I got to challenge people through my design, through my research. It is in this building that I discovered more of me. So yeah, love and hate, but leaning more towards hate. And then after that, and I have a lot more to say about it, but I think as we discussed more, I could always go back. I could get back to that. The second building I want to talk about is Museo Sitio de Pachacamac. It's in Peru. It is a building that I had to, that I studied as part of a workshop. My school organized this, they had this prize called the Miss Van der Rohe, Miss Crown Hall America Prize, which was about creating a conversation between North and South America. And it also was set up in a way that allowed students to be part of the process, which is something that I think was very innovative and powerful. So there were 6 finalists and 6 finalist buildings, and students had to focus on each of them and analyze them and create a series of models and drawings to be able to talk about them the day of the symposium. And so I had to study this building, which basically, I mean, it's a museum for the historic site, the archaeological site. And one of the many things I found powerful about it is the way through which it is part of the site. It responds to the site, but it's also very modern by the use of the materials and the way it is designed. I loved the humility through which the designers, the architects went about creating this space that is, it is very futuristic, and it can be a very like very, sorry, my French is coming up, I apologize. It's a great landmark for a tourist, but when you look into the way it's done and you see the way it performs, it actually is scattered around the locals. So on this image, you see one feature of the building that I really like. I think it's very monumental. It's very artistic. And on this side here, this is a model that I made as part of as a supporting element of my the conversation that I was moderating with, and then I was trying to kind of express how the building showcases views, how it frames the views of the site. And this is another piece that I worked on, kind of connecting the angles and the shape, the form of the building with the plan. So yeah, I will going to stop sharing now. And so I brought up these two buildings kind of as a way to say that for me, I look, when I think of architecture as a tool for social advocacy, I can break it down with first design intention, process of design and build project. I'm really interested to know how the architects engage the public, engage the users, which is, you would think that this is something that is done most of the time, but unfortunately, most of the time when we look at the projects that are being done today, it's really not about the people. It's mostly about making sure that we have a very Instagrammable, prize-winning product. And so I'm interested to discuss more about that, and I hope that I made my point clear. So that's it.
I think you did. Thank you so much. Kaneza, do you also want me to skip your bio?
Let's skip it. It's
All
so
right.
nice to hear all these extraordinary humans speak. I work in performance, in theater and opera and dance. So on the one hand, performance is kind of the anti-monument. It is created by a collectivity and given unto a collectivity, and then it disappears. So in the Western lens, we end up looking at the containers or the frames, the Dionysian amphitheaters or the gold-crusted Broadway balconies or remnants of WPA murals in lobbies. But when we start to move outside of Western lenses, we get to think about performance itself as the monument, histories of performance, histories of ritual as the monument itself. So I'm particularly interested in the ways that performance score travels, that travels over thousands of years. For example, you look at a text like Going Forth by Day, this canon of 4,000-year-old Egyptian funerary writings that function as a guide to the afterlife. They are these performance scores that have been passed on for thousands of years. They are these monuments. The performance score is a monument to death and to rebirth. And the same goes with religious ceremonies, you know, the way they're passed and documented outlines a kind of collective performance action or monument. And listening to everyone talk, you know, thinking about the 6-foot tables that mark the absence of the vendor, that mark the absence of this social activity, that in fact, we're talking about that monument as a marker of what is not there, of this centralizing of a kind of human presence that is not there, or how even houses on the Underground Railroad as monument, as museum. This marks a human movement and a radical performance of survival and triumph. And in a way, holding that in the way Gerald was so beautifully talking about experiencing, identifying that architecture is pointing to this performance monument. So I'm excited about the ways in which we can think monument and hold the human activity at the center. And the way I think about that in my practice is as performance activity as the monumental. So I'm interested in the ways, I'm interested in the model for a participatory society implied when we think about performance itself as monument.
I loved that. I'm so happy. Thank you guys so much. Hank, am I also skipping your bio?
You just want me to be that. I'm like, you should read my bio just so I can act and feel different. No, I'm good. I do have a special message for Gerald.
I love that everyone is rocking their shirts.
Yo, that's so crazy.
Alex Bell had it in her stories today as well. I was like, I want mine.
I wear mine every day, every chance I get.
I wish you could see us all clapping. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hank, you
so
ready?
if you, yeah. So thank you for reminding me that we're always together, Gerald, and that like we're all together in spirit. It's weird to be on a panel. It's my first time ever talking with Kaneza. Hi, it's great to meet you, Walter. Nice to meet you, Nyla. Naila or Nyla?
Nyla.
Cool, and thank you for having me, Niama. Yeah, but so why'd you make me go after Kaneza? I don't have anything to say, frankly. I'm trying to process all of the different, because Walter brought the 6-foot tables, you know. I'm like, okay, I have been wanting to bring something relevant and new to this conversation, which, as you know, I always come late with it. Niama. This is, I hate to say it, but we're monuments. You know, like every time I see a Black person in America walking through the street, you know, I recognize that, you know, that we're monuments to our ancestors in the struggles, whether you migrated here or whether they migrated here or were kidnapped and brought here. That like we are living monuments, you know, to the indelible spirit of Africans, and in this millennia. I was thinking a lot about when Nyla was talking, I was thinking about Great Zimbabwe and Kaneza. I was thinking about places that are not kind of on the traditional mindset. We think about, you know, monuments, you know, we think about the pyramids and the Mayan pyramids, we think about the Egyptian pyramids, but what about the you know, the other kind of monuments that are left on the continent for us to ponder about our complexity, you know? But yeah, I'm a monument. All of our ancestors were like bricks. Each of them a brick in building us up. So I appreciate sharing this moment with you. And tell me, how does it tie into your, I'm sorry, you know me. I hate, see, Niama's all professional and stuff, and I'm always a hot mess. But I'm surprised that Walter didn't talk about the piece behind you and how that ties into this.
Well, Walter?
Yeah, so this is like a series I've been working on around like ropes and like how do we use a mundane object like ropes and knots to connect parallels to humans and human connections. So thinking about, I guess the Gerald's point about architecture as history too is like, what are the histories throughout ropes that connect people? So like, for instance, this one up here is like this knot that, it's the knot that they say the phrase tying the knot comes from, right? It's like this 5,000-year-old Egyptian knot. And the properties of it are very human in the sense that when you try to pull it apart, it gets tighter and you have to loosen it up in order for the knot to be released. And what does that mean for us as we connect with people? Or the one below in the green is the sheepshank knot, which is like this knot that's used to support other knots. And if it has too much of a load, it falls apart. And if it doesn't have enough of a load, it also falls apart. So thinking about when we're questioning our purposes versus when we have too much on our plate, what happens? How do we create that balance? So I'm just always thinking about like, how do I connect these knots to us as humans, which I guess plays into your idea, Hank, about us being monuments as well.
What's that last one? Because I need that one.
This one down here is called a sheepshank knot.
Sheepshank knot.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna remember that. That metaphor is pretty intense.
Yeah. Yeah. So like even this one up here is called the lark's head knot, which is like the knot you use to tie your tags to your luggage. So that piece is called Diasporic Dispatch. Just thinking about who gets to travel, like in these day and age, it's something that's promoted amongst Black people now, right? This idea of like, we can travel versus forced travel in a certain period of time. And even in these days, right? There's countries that are still experiencing slavery. So just constantly thinking about this little object that we pass by, what are all these different meanings that can connect architecturally and humanly as well?
And I think the last time I was at your studio, we talked about like jute itself and just where that was being grown, where that comes from,
right.
all those ideas around colonialism, of course, as part of that story as well. You all give me so much to think about, and I'm just like, oh, what is the question? Because we're now in a place where we should be having a conversation together. And I think, you know, the title of this series, it's interestingly, my plan was actually not to moderate this conversation, but here we are. And so this whole series is called Marking Absences, Shifting Narratives, right? And Walter in particular, your object is actually exactly that, marking absences, marking what we don't see, particularly in this moment. There's so much we don't see. And I wonder about how all of you think about the objects that you've talked about, or bodies in your case, Hank, as containers for emotion as well. Yeah, unmute, everybody unmute.
So I'm taken back to when we first talked about this, and you said, oh yeah, like think of like, you know, architecture as monuments. And I remember I told you, oh, well, it doesn't have to be something that is a monument that was designed to be a monument. I'm thinking about when I grew up in my neighborhood, there's this little, I think it was probably an some sort of electrical stuff for the neighborhood, and it was covered by a concrete box, and it was right across from the store where we all went to. And every day around like 5 p.m. you saw all the guys in the neighborhood just hanging there. And as we were talking, I just pictured that thing and these people, and I felt really sad, because I thought, wow, I wish I had a picture of this, and I wish I could actually have that in the talk and discuss this kind of experience that I had with this monument that was not designed to be one. And then I'm thinking about what Gerald does with his account. What I love the most about it is because is the fact that I saw excerpt of my experience in my neighborhood in Gabon. I saw that through what he's showcasing, which again, it's these buildings that were probably mostly not really designed to for Black people to interact with, for Black people to call home. But they, just looking at them, they told the story of the people living there. They told they told that experience. And so for me, it's just, again, I'm taken back to this kind of pain of thinking, wow, like I really wish I could show you my experience growing up in Gabon, but I'm also grateful that I can tell you that through the work that you're doing, Gerald, and the conversation that we're having now, I have that. Like I am taken back to that. So yes, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that. It's amazing to think that, you know, there are bits of our experience that we haven't yet uncovered, you know, contemporarily. That was really fascinating to me when I was walking up my mom's street, my childhood street last year, and thinking like, oh, I don't think this exists. Like, you know, here these homes are, these that mostly Black folks live in now. And here's this huge fight that we're fighting against, you know, these powers that come and truly do identify them as what they are. And like that being our starting point is really brilliant. But you know how Black folk do, which I'm obsessed with, is like we claim things as ours all the time that wasn't intended for us. Like, and then we just make it, you know, like, I think that we probably agree that like a lot of times we make it better, you know, and that's been a bunch of our experience, like, you know, here, you know, in North America. And thinking about my great aunts who came up here, and, you know, my grandmother and them were like, you know, housemaids, and then they flipped fashion for all of us, right? They were the big, you know, they were born in like the late, in the early 20s, late teens, and then they flipped fashion for us because they basically took what they could afford with the thrift and high fashion of the time and created the style that became funk and that became hip hop, you know, style, with the remix of these things. And so I love I'm actually quite obsessed with things that are not intended for us, you know, like maybe even a little bit more than like the things that are made for us, you know, because of the experience that you know, it's nothing like, I'm like I used to skate crazy, and it's nothing like taking stuff like that wasn't meant for you and then flipping it, you know? And then when people see it now, it's like a re-identification. So it's like how we did the Chrysler 300, you know what I'm saying?
But I think something about that is also akin to improvisation, and just this notion that Black people have this ability to like improvise in a way that is actually much less happenstance than I think is assigned to it. It's actually much more about spirit, and it's much more connected to like this thing that is just sort of innately inside of us. I want to read Flash Spirit if you haven't yet.
And real quick, y'all, like we really haven't talked about how that may make someone feel. Like how our presence and being able to do that is like, it's quite the phenomenon. Like we brush over it, and like what Hank has done, you know what I mean, in this space, like, you know, like the things that he has flipped in this space, you know, to like, you know, people can't do it. And it's like quite phenomenal. And it's something that we think about and like get rid of, and we keep going on to the next thing. And I think that, you know, understanding our impact and connecting to our identity in that way is that's like how people see us. The same thing with your melanin. Like people are quite mad. Like a lot of people go to try to emulate that on a daily, and here we are just glowing like on a regular, that's a thing. You know what I mean? Like I think we could one day be like, huh, you know. But anyway, little tangent.
And I wonder too about some way that all of these architectures have actually always been about us. That the colonial architecture at home in Gabon, that was entirely in relation to Black populace, to Blackness, that the colonial structures are absolutely in relation to indigenous bodies that have been erased from that hill, that are absolutely in relation to the labor of African Americans who built the damn houses. So that shit has always been about us. And so I'm also interested in that way that we are at the center.
That's real.
Part of what I was thinking through in terms of thinking about this particular conversation, obviously I'm not a scholar of architecture, but just thinking about modern architecture, thinking about architecture as containers for something, as ultimately the idea is to constrict movement in some way or another. And I wonder about, are you saying something, Walter, or?
I can say something.
It looks like you want to say something. So I'm gonna let you say something.
I was just thinking about, from the responses so far, two examples that come to mind. One of them thinking about like how are Black people and people of color repurposing things that may not necessarily be for them. I think of this collective from the 70s in the Lower East Side called the Shars, right? There's this book that came out in 1973 called The Improbable Dome Builders. So this group in the Lower East Side, 6 former gang members, they were experiencing gentrification at a rapid rate in that neighborhood, and they were trying to figure out what is an alternate for us to live in outside of project housing. And they were starting to get interested in Buckminster Fuller and his geodesic domes. And through a series of fortunate events, they ended up meeting Fuller's assistant, Michael Ely. And they connect. And then they start getting trained by Michael and Buckminster on how to create these geodesic domes, and they make them in the Lower East Side. So now they create it into a project where their neighbors are getting involved. So now they have people in the projects coming out every day to say, hey, how about we build our own housing? And it doesn't even have to look the way it looks currently. We can make it look the way we want and take on geometry and trigonometry in ways that we didn't even make it past certain grades in school, but that doesn't mean we can't take on this new knowledge. So it becomes this really powerful experience of community building to create what they can imagine, to live inside of. So imagine one of these in the Lower East Side in the middle of the projects in the 70s.
Wow.
Or also, and thinking about absence and lack thereof, or not enough of, I also think about Black women architects and Black queer women architects. Main one that comes to mind is Amazili Meredith, and she built this amazing home in Virginia in the 20s, right? And it was a very modernist approach to her architecture during the 20s and 30s, where she was trying to think ahead of like, one, I'm queer and I live with my partner and we live in Virginia. So how do I create architecture for ourselves that it's not us hiding, but it's us having our privacy? So she develops this home called the Zurich South, where she creates this beautiful home where once you're inside the space, it's really open, but from the street, you can't see too much. So it becomes this parallel of her existence as a human being. So I'm always thinking about those two examples when it comes to absence or lack thereof representation inside of architecture.
How do you spell her name?
Amaza is M-A-A-Z-A. Lee Meredith.
Feels like this idea of the public and private space is that's been on my mind so much right now, in the sense that there are so many New York Cities and there are so many Chicagos and there are so many Cincinnatis. Even if we were all in the same city, we would inhabit very different cities in some ways, and we'd also probably overlap in many ways as well. But to gather a public of a city, to gather a New York City public that represents this place, is this wild, radical act of invitation. And what are the ways that it is actually only through invitation that that meeting can happen? And what is the function of the private space as a place of home, as a place of restitution, as a place of hospitality? That in fact it is by invitation only that contact with a public can happen. And this myth of public space that our cultural institutions are obsessed with, while simultaneously disinviting massive swaths of cities over long periods of time. I'm interested in how we think about private space as a place for radical invitation that allows us to have our work have contact with a public, with a representative public.
Would that be through consciousness? And I say that because earlier, when I was introducing myself, I talked about how I learned more about myself here. And I remember, again, I came to the US. I know about Black people, I know about Blackness. I know about the big Black figures, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, but I didn't know much. I didn't know about myself. And which means that I didn't feel invited, and I couldn't have been invited to certain spaces, even if they were catered around me or they were inviting towards me. I would have been in a museum, I would have attended a show, but I wouldn't have received it the way I can receive it now, because I hadn't reached that state of consciousness that is necessary to connect, that is necessary to receive. And so my first year, well, I had to learn English because I couldn't speak it. That was the first thing. And then I attended, I went to a community college at first, and I learned, well, I was surrounded by a lot of Black people from outside of Chicago. And I remember I used to feel very confused about what I thought was a lack of interest in school. And I felt very upset at the stereotypes that I was harboring then. I thought, oh, you guys don't care. Oh, you guys are violent, because that's everything that I saw. Until I woke up someday and I thought, no, this does not make any sense. And thankfully for my English 101 class, I learned Invisible Men. And well, I read Invisible Men, and I wrote about the Chicago Housing Authority, and then I became a radical, right? And so I started my journey into consciousness, and I started receiving a lot. So to go back to the question that you asked, which is, how do we determine private space versus in relationship to public space? I think it is about consciousness, because we can cater spaces for Black people, but not all Black people can feel invited or even feel invited by themselves, because not all Black people are the same. Not all Black people have reached the level of consciousness needed to receive. So
it's real.
Yeah, I also think about a lot of things, but part of it being the sense of, at least within a Western context, of ownership creates this space between public and private. If you feel even if it's a public space, if you help co-create it, it creates a different level of ownership. It's like, maybe I'm willing to maintain it more, maybe I'm willing to frequent it more, maybe I'm willing to interact within it more. But if I don't have any parts in creating it and then I'm told it's for me, it's a very different interaction with that space.
100%.
Versus me helping be a part of it from day one. Or even this idea, because then what ends up happening is we start or not we, I should say, a lot of white male architects start developing this idea of defensive architecture, right? To create a divide between what can be public and private. Like this idea of, if we create small private areas, then we feel more ownership within public spaces. But we know that doesn't work either, right? So it's this constant idea of like, instead of painting a mural on a wall because you want to do that, what happens when you knock on everybody's door and ask them what they want to see on that wall instead? You know, so how do we create this like level of co-creation instead when it comes to architecture and public spaces?
And monuments and public
art.
art.
Right.
So on and so on.
All of it, right.
Which is the point of all of these conversations that we've had over the last few days. And I think in some ways, this leads me to the next question. How do you think about your work as a tool for social advocacy in particular? And obviously, each of you are approaching life from completely different standpoints. Your work is varied. Some of you are creative. I mean, actually, in your case, Nyla, you're kind of in this interesting place where you're like looking at art and you're looking at architecture and you're looking at fashion. It's interesting. So I would love to hear from each of you about that. Whoever.
Can you state the question again?
Sure.
First part of it.
Yeah. So thinking about your work as a tool for social advocacy, how do you think about that? How do you want that to exist in the world? Obviously, like your intention versus what someone receives may be completely different, but I wonder on a most sort of internal, personal level, what do you think?
Yeah, Gerald, what do you think?
That's crazy. Damn. Yo, I don't know, man. Like the connection, like the cultural connection to your neighborhood or your lived space. Like Walter was talking about, like you feeling like it's yours, and this, and especially in this time, is like I feel like my biggest, like the thing that I wanted to do and wanted to make sure that people knew that, like, you know, a lot of our names are not even like connected to our culture, and it's like what do we have that's ours? And it's like these memories of like growing up and riding down the expressway and like owning a building, like that's my building, you know, and or just having this connection to your aunt's crib, and then, you know, really being able to like define and vibe with it. I'm not really, as like a lot of people think I'm like, oh, this kid's like crazy in modern architecture. Like, nah, bro, like I'm just like, I'm wanting to like go through life and start to check off like the things that are in my experience box a lot. And then like, you know, it's been that for me. So you know, that's like my favorite thing, is being able to for us to connect to shit, you know, and that's been like, you know, I want to do that, continue to do that in culture as well. Like right now, the Funk Museum here in Ohio is like out of business, and like it's like really terrible if you think about the, you know, the growth of like funk became pop culture, became hip hop, became so like style, how you talk, how you dress, whatever. And there's like Cooper Hewitt or like none of these design like entities are like considering our design history. Right. One of my favorite examples is like LeBron's team. Like I'm from Ohio. So like LeBron's team, that is like his marketing and design folks. We think of like LeBron's brand, you know, in this light of a Coca-Cola, Pepsi, a Jordan brand. It's like these kids like started this stuff like at like throwing parties as a kid, and their boy blew up, and then now they support him, you know, and his efforts in design. I want to see a retrospect of their work, like when they were kids, you know, what influenced them to like, you know, align themselves with that. And that's what I think that my account and my artwork is continuing to do, is to uncover some of the really like very, very, very regular mundane things that we continue to like, you know, go to high places to like experience, but like in the lowlands, like everybody is experiencing these things every day. So what about you, Hank? Can I walk? I'm going to walk around while you, do you mind if I show your
I mean, you're there. Thank you. I mean, I'm honored that you would even take the time to go, you know, into a public space like this and then make, because, you know, this is the only version of the show I haven't seen in person yet. And I'm trying to figure out how to
Yo,
get.
you got to come through. You can stay at mom's crib.
All right, cool. I mean, I wonder if I've been there through mom's crib already.
Probably so.
But definitely, I already. So this is my service show, which is 20 plus years of work, looking at different methods of understanding Black history, Black culture, you know, through these old runaway slave ads that I turned the images from them into gold and diamond chains, onto like monumental works like these pins. You know, can you turn to the right? The pin to your right, the "I am the greatest." I've never. How generous are you to be able to do this for me?
Nah, this is crazy.
But yeah, I took these like pin back buttons, and if you go around the side of them, you can see that they actually are like big pins that, if you were bold enough, you could actually pin into yourself.
Snap! I didn't even see that.
And, so they're 3-foot pins. I blew them up, and thinking about, you know, someone named Cassius Marcellus Clay from Kentucky, just across the border, who was raised in the segregated South of limited means, who told the world at 22 years old that he was the greatest. And the statement "I am" is the most powerful 2 words in the English language, because whatever follows them literally dictates reality. And so the power that he did when he created himself, defined himself as a monument, translated across space and time until after he's moved on into the next world. So this is a series called Unbranded, where I've been looking on at ads and how they shape our notions of ourselves and our reality. I think on the right side it looks like Unbranded: A Century of White Women, where I looked at that idea, and then this is Unbranded: Reflections of Black by Corporate America, where I'm also thinking about how our notions of race and gender are shaped through corporate identities. So looks good.
It looks crazy, bro.
Oh, good.
So anyway, I won't be distracting, but yeah, that's good.
It's dope. And you got to go to other rooms too. You saw the video.
Yeah, I just thought I got to sit down with it though.
James Baldwin one especially.
Yeah.
I like this family affairs vibe that you put together, curator.
This is like, so like, I feel like we're just on a Zoom with each other and like there's no one else really watching, but there are other people.
Oh, how about you and your work?
Me?
Yeah, way to dodge your own questions.
I'm like, what was the question?
What was my question that I wrote? Exactly. Hard questions.
I honestly would rather like we go through all the panelists and then come back to me.
Look at my notebook. What's your question? I just turned to a page in my notebook. What is your question?
I can't with you at all. Walter. Do you need the question?
I guess I got it. I think I'm always thinking about what do we not know we don't know, and also always looking through history about like different things that get misplaced or buried under the stack. A lot like Amaza, like her work, when I found it, it was a lot like, why haven't I heard this before? And this was 80 years ago, you know what I'm saying? And her stuff is so relevant. Yeah.
I wonder if we learned about that through the same thing.
It was in Dark Space by Mario Gooden. He talks about her work. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a great book. He's a great architect.
Yeah. Mario's dope.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm always thinking about like, what are ways that I can use familiar formats to tell these histories or stories that should be told? Like right now, besides these knots, working on this series of making these fictional blueprints about these made up places that help tell stories about our history through architecture, and through different topics like gentrification or school to prison pipeline, just telling these different things that relate to Blackness and the Black experience through architecture and the built environment. Using formats that I'm always using people like my grandmother as a benchmark. Like if she can figure it out, then I'm doing my job, you know, so that as many people as possible are accessible to the work that I'm creating. Because I like putting my work in places that not necessarily are traditional art spaces. I'd rather have it in the hood somewhere where people can access it that need that information versus in a white box where people who are expected to frequent that space are going to see it.
Can you talk
so I'm also,
your gallery project real quick?
Say one more time, please.
Your gallery project, Walter.
Yeah, so I've been working on this I co-founded this collective with my co-founder, Alan Frempong, called Zio. And it's this idea of how are we creating space for Black artists to thrive in many different ways, or as many ways as possible. So right now, we have a physical space in Inglewood where we have an incubation space for Black artists where they can stay there and get to work, just start working on their work. And while they're there, we can help incubate them in different ways, whether it's helping them connect to different people in the art world, getting them studio visits, just always figuring out ways that we're creating space for them. And then also just because of the pandemic, figuring out virtual ways to do it. So every month we'll have events where we'll do things called Spread the Wealth, where we'll have Black art professionals run workshops on like, how do you price your work? How do you sell your work? What are the different ways to navigate the art world? Just these soft skills that we don't often get taught once we enter these industries. It's kind of like expected that you know how to do these things. So we're always trying to figure out ways, not just, hey, we want you to succeed, but what are the scaffolds that we need to build in order for you to succeed as well, so that you can reach out and help other people once you learn those skills. So what's like this constant give and take between Black artists that we can create so that it becomes a more natural process and not this like exceptionalism of like, we have a few Black artists that are killing it versus like, there's every few Black artists are killing it, there's probably 1,000 more that are equally as talented, and how do we create space for them as well? And that doesn't have to be just one or two places. It actually can be a network of places throughout. So we're always thinking of Zio also as like a gym membership of like, once you join the Zio family, what are all the different things you get access to as well? So that's kind of what we've been working on.
Super inspiring. Thank you.
So,
yeah.
Good. Kaneza or Nyla, if you want to answer.
In the same way that all art is political, I think all art is social practice art. And the question is, how well do you use your materials? How adept are you at using the materials that are actually in the room? And these are aesthetic and formal you know, creative materials, and these are also experiential materials and historical materials and cultural materials. So, you know, when Nyla is talking about the Crown Plaza, Crown Center, did I say this? Sorry, not Crown, beg your pardon.
Crown Hall.
Crown Hall, beg your pardon, beg your pardon. When she's talking about Crown Hall, or when she's talking about the other museum, she's talking about the social materials. There's no loss of her love of formal exquisiteness and experimentation, that we don't have to leave any of these things behind. You know, you look at this beautiful show of Hanks, a master in thinking of, you know, in addressing all the materials in the room. I think that to me, as a maker of performance, that's what I'm always looking for, is how do I address all of the materials in the room? And for the people who are making work not thinking about everything that's in there, they need to catch up to this game of excellence that we are in.
I love it. You know that we have a name for Kaneza, which I'm not going to say.
Oh God.
But like, let's just say she's militantly earnest about her people, and I love it when she gets on her soapbox, because you can feel her right on the edge, you know, and it's so beautiful, you know, and super humbling, inspiring to just hear you just stake this claim, you know. And I think oftentimes when we think about theater, we think about it as entertainment, you know. We don't think about it as a space to be pushed, to be challenged, to rethink, and that's usually space that's left for fine art that we don't, abstract art we don't understand, so to speak. And I love that you in this time have kind of doubled down on theater, even though most people can't even go to these spaces. And so I wonder what it means for you in the context of the work that you're doing to hold space for the, you know, literally for the future. You know, when we think about theater spaces, we may not be able to sit in these theaters together for another 2 years. What does it mean for you? Why are you so committed as a director, as a performer, to this?
I am committed to this creation by collectivity unto collectivity that has been happening for thousands of years. And while it is not safe for us to all gather indoors, the practice of tending to each other's lives, selves, and stories through performance will continue, whether that's Black Lives Matter protests and die-ins and development of new march formations, or whether that is sitting in 2,000 seat, you know, whatever, theaters. So I think we all have this unique opportunity to be in the bones of our practices, and particularly theaters that don't expect to join again. We get to kind of like crack and reset the bones. So I am trying to leverage that cracking so we can really do some resetting.
Some creative chiropractics, I guess.
Nyla, I would love to hear your response to the question.
First, Kaneza, really, every time you speak, I feel like energized.
I can't wait to see your work.
I know, but I love how your energy just kind of goes. I just want to thank you for that, for your enthusiasm, especially when, as Hank said earlier, like you are like the most affected, given that we can't gather, but you right now, I would say you're the most energetic. And so thank you for that. So being a recent grad, my work has so far mostly been about absorbing the tools. When I came here, my goal was clear. I'm gonna learn how to be an architect, and then I'm going back home, because it didn't take forever to realize that none of the things that I was taught was about me or my people. But I could still take the tools though. and apply it and apply it back home. And then I had some design practice, I had some commission work where I had to now design. And then I quickly realized that, well, I'm not designing as I should be designing. This is looking a lot like Miss Vendor. It's looking a lot like Crown Hall. It's looking a lot like, Frank Lloyd Wright. Like all my references are Western when it shouldn't be. And then I'm thinking, okay, let me see what's out there. Let me learn more about African architecture. And then I go in the library and I see that a lot of these books that will be considered a lot as good books, they're not written by people who look like me. It's all white people. It's like, what is going on? And so I'm thinking, wow, so there's a problem. I started kind of feeling bad, feeling like I was not a good designer because I'm not able to translate, I'm not able to convey what I am as an African woman. And so lately I decided that eventually I would go back to school and do some more research. Right now I'm working on getting into a program that will allow me to travel throughout the continent, focus on about 10 cities, and really learn about the architecture, not from, again, what Gerald does is great. I think that that practice of documenting is needed. It's powerful, but what I want to do is kind of going beyond that, not just looking at, okay, these are these buildings and stuff, but really looking at how people live. Because at the end of the day, architecture is about people, is a translation of how people live. And I don't see that much, especially when it comes to our people. So I want to get into communities, get out of what the stereotypes that I have right now, that vision that I have right now of what good design is, what good spatial responses are, and really study, okay, so you have this, let's say this family, an example, right? Polygamy is still legal in Gabon, in many countries in West Africa, right? So how do you see what kind of architectural responses are there to this societal situation, right? I want to say societal issue for obvious reasons, but I would say for what are the spatial responses to that, right? How do people build to accommodate to this, right? And so I want to look at that and now see how I could utilize these responses in a Western setting, or even like West African setting or Central African setting. And so everything that I think about doing right now as far as design is concerned is just guessing, right? And so to respond to what is my work about right now is this really this transition into learning more about us and getting better tools, because the tools that I have right now, they're very incomplete. I want to find these tools that I could share with you, I could share with the community, but more importantly, I want that process to be something that inspires, something that triggers more designers, more African designers, more Black designers to do the same thing, so that we can finally have more books written by Black people about Africa, as we should. So yeah, so that's the response.
Walter gave you poetry snaps. I don't know if you saw.
It's important.
I think I'm going to get away without answering this question. I think, yes, it's happening. I want to thank you all so much for your time this afternoon. And of course, the work that you've been doing, which is part of why I invited you here. So I'm super grateful for your presence on this earth in this moment. So thank you.
Thank you for your generosity and making space for us to come together. I think we'll be building these connections and weaving them tighter for years to come. So much love. I don't have Walter's Instagram.
It's
and number 2, oceans.
I will put it.
I think something I just thought about real quick, if I can share it, is this idea of thinking about language and the word architecture, and thinking about how, in the Western context, as a profession, it's maybe like 150, 175 years old. And prior to that, it was really based on apprenticeship and learning from someone who understood that. And prior to that, in the rest of the world, this idea of architecture is an idea of manifestation, right? Of like, how do we take something that's in our head and manifest that into reality? So I think that's something we should take moving forward, is like, I'm not saying use the word architecture less, but think about manifestation before we say the word architecture. What are we trying to manifest?
That's hot.
That's hot. In the chat. Well, this was actually just, she said this panel is pure alchemy. I think alchemy is actually a great
For sure.
idea. Yeah, again, thank you all so much. I'm gonna let Catherine take us out.
Yeah, thank you all so much. I feel like this was my favorite conversation of the 4 conversations, just because of the energy that was created today and the space for exchange. I know I'm inspired, so I feel like I'm going to go out into Queens with new eyes after this conversation today. So thank you all so much for your contributions. Thank you again to Niama for curating not just this conversation, but the whole series. And thank you everyone who came and shared the space with us today. I hope you enjoyed.
Make sure y'all vote. Make sure y'all vote.
Vote.
Vote early.
I cannot vote, so.
That's cool.
We'll bring somebody to polls.
Early. Right.
So Ohio, we need you.
Early voting in New York City starts Saturday.
10 a.m.
So, yeah, absolutely. And, you know, all of the other actions as well. There's all sorts of stuff going on right now. So anyway, thank you all again and again and again. It's been a pleasure to host you. It's been a pleasure to see all of you and listen to you. And yeah, follow all these great folks on social media. I can't wait to see what you're working on. And yeah, take care.
Cheers, y'all.
Manifesting.
Y'all. Manifest.
Thank you.
Word. Good day. Oh.